never use a verb besides said to carry dialogue, he asserted. So this is another one of those rules of writing that gets thrown around, like don't use adverbs or don't use the passive voice. Don't use any word besides said. This was actually one of Elmore Leonard's rules of writing. I don't remember which one exactly, but it was never use any word besides said to carry dialogue. And there's a lot of debate over this. If we go and look at the literature, just like with the other things, are there best-selling authors that use words besides said? Absolutely. So you have permission to use words besides said, but of course that would not make a very thorough and, in my opinion, informative video. So I'm going to go just a little bit deeper. Now, a personal anecdote. I remember way back, I don't know, in elementary school, I think I was probably 10 or something, 10 or 11. We had an assignment to write a story, and we weren't allowed to use the word said except for one time. So we had to use other verbs like exclaimed or replied or asked or something like that. And I remember coming up with all kinds of different words to replace said with. And I thought maybe this was like some kind of rule. Now, it may have just been that the teacher was trying to get us to think creatively about different verbs. It may have been that she thought that you really weren't supposed to use said that much. But I remember going and reading other books and realizing, well, they never use any word besides said. They don't use any of these additional words. They only say said. So is that a bad rule, or was the teacher, I don't really know why they did it, but of course there are authors that really only use said, and there's authors that use other words besides said, and in some cases use many other words besides said. I think for Elmore Leonard, I think he described like having to go to the dictionary at one point to figure out what a really obscure verb was because the author didn't want to say said. It's like you can just say said rather than doing something really odd. Now, which side of the debate do I come down on? I will give lots of information for my opinion once I give it, but I really come down on the Elmore Leonard side. I think a preponderance, a large number of different words to replace the verb said is too much. I think you can occasionally replace it if it is going to add to the effect of the dialogue, if you are informing the reader as to how the dialogue is being performed in a very specific way that matters to the dialogue. So let me just say this. Kind of like with adverbs, if the information you're trying to convey with that verb is actually in the dialogue itself, you don't need to replace the verb said. For example, if you have an exclamation point, you do not need to say exclaimed. You probably don't even need to say shouted unless they're saying it like they're screaming it. Screaming is probably different, you might want to say screamed, but you don't need to say exclaimed because we have an exclamation point. Likewise, if there's a question mark, you don't ever need to use the word asked. Why? Because we know he's asking a question because there's a question mark there. Now you can use asked, but you don't have to use asked. You can use said if you want to. In fact, I usually do use the word said. Now, the word said to me is like the word and. The word and is not objectionable. You don't really notice it. It's not like you don't read it. Some people say, oh, well, readers just don't even see the word said. No, I think they see the word said just like they see the word and. But you become very aware of the word said if you see it a lot. Just like how there's a run-on sentence, this and this. If you see 3 ands in a row or 2 ands in a row, you start to notice that the word and is in a sentence a lot, or there's a lot of the word and in a paragraph. So when you see too much of the word said, that is when the word said starts to become present on the page. When you start to really say, oh, they're saying said a lot. You get kind of a monotonous feeling if it's Bert said and John said and Bill said and Robert said and So there's a couple ways to avoid that monotonousness, one of which is to replace the verb said. You can replace it with something else, and that will break up the flow where you have said. So that's a really good place to replace the verb said. Another thing you can do is if there's 2 speakers, you can just drop dialogue tags entirely, or at least make them really occasional. So what I do is I tend to make the dialogue tags a lot more occasional, just a reminder of who's saying what. So if there's just 2 speakers, once you've established the 2 speakers, you don't need to use dialogue tags. You can just rattle off quote, 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 and it works fine. Just like if you were reading a drama or reading a screenplay or something like that, you would have that dialogue tag over on the side to say said. You don't really need it in prose because there's only two actors involved, so to speak. So you can just listed that way. Now, if you have a lot of different speakers, you have to tag the dialogue somehow. As soon as you get to 3, things get a little bit more complicated because you can't just drop the dialogue tags entirely. So you could replace the verb, but there's other options too. So one of the things that you could do is, rather than using a verb to carry the dialogue, such as said or exclaimed or asked or chortled or retorted or whatever cool verb you come up with, you can simply describe something that the character is doing. You can describe an action that they're doing, scratching their neck. You can just say Gandalf puffed out a smoke ring. I don't think so, Bilbo, right? So you describe the character doing something, then you have the quote, and you carry the dialogue by showing what's happening in the scene, rather than by simply saying this person said this. And I think this can add a little bit of extra flavor in the scene. It can also help you drop descriptions of what's going on. So rather than having a bunch of hoop-de-doodle, which is another Elmore Leonard word, like a big bunch of paragraphs describing some scene and then a bunch of dialogue without it. You can do that too. But you can drop some extra little things here and there. You can communicate some extra bits of feeling that isn't normally in the dialogue, like, maybe his smile dropped. Bob's smile dropped. I never knew her, right? So you've avoided using the word said, and you've described something about Bob, something that he's doing. You've shown the reader you've given him a visual of something that Bob is doing that adds to the dialogue. And in that way, you can avoid some of that monotonousness of said without having to use some like obscure verb. In my opinion, if there's a whole bunch of these verbs, it starts to weaken the writing. If you start seeing a bunch of different things replacing said, you start to notice the dialogue tags a lot more than if they just said. And in a lot of cases, using a different verb, it's kind of like an adverb. Same thing with adverbs. The information might already be there in the dialogue. So if the character is saying something very hateful, you don't need to say he shouted hatefully, right? You don't need to say that. It's in the dialogue. You could just leave no dialogue tag. Just make sure, or da-da, he shouted, or duh, he said. And that's pretty much good enough. So you don't need a special verb, and you probably don't need an adverb if the dialogue is written well. If you have the information contained in the dialogue that will let the reader know how it's being said and the intent behind it. If you're writing good dialogue, you really don't need a lot of adverbs, and you really don't need a lot of verbs to replace said. You don't need these crazy different verbs to carry dialogue. So that's really my advice. There's different ways to do it without having to do lots of replacements. As soon as I start to see an author do lots and lots of replacements, and some of them do it, to me it disrupts the flow of the dialogue. It weakens the writing because you end up kind of in a, like, you're creating tautologies. If you say, get out of here, he exclaimed. Well, we already know that he's exclaiming it because there's an exclamation point. What are you doing? He asked. Well, we already know he's asked because it's got an exclamation point. You look ridiculous, he chortled. We can already kind of get that from the way that he said it. Or we wouldn't have to say chortled. He laughed and said, you look ridiculous. But you could use chortled, right? It's very efficient. So it's kind of like adverbs. Those verbs can be really efficient, and they can be evocative. They can help the dialogue. But in some cases, they can weaken it. And it becomes really obvious to me that a writer is trying to not say said because they're replacing lots of said with other verbs. You become much more aware of that. It no longer adds to it, and you can get this kind of feeling that it just feels a little bit weak. The words become disruptive to the flow of the dialogue on the page to me. So yeah, I come down on the use said area of it, but I'm not absolute. Like, rules are made to be broken. In Keys to Prolific Creativity, I have break the rules. It's really hard to be creative if you don't give yourself permission to violate the norms and standards of whatever medium you're in to some degree, that you don't give yourself permission to be a rebel, you don't give yourself permission to do it a different way. That's part of being creative, is working outside the boundaries a little bit. But you may get feedback if you're using lots of different verbs and adverbs, that these things are weakening your writing, and in a lot of cases they are. So if you focus on making the dialogue really good, a lot of cases you don't need a weird adverb, you don't need like a weird verb, you can just say said, and the reader is going to get what's going on in that particular scene and with that particular piece of dialogue. So anyway, leave me your thoughts down below, whether you think, should you use said, should you not use said? Are there instances where you can't use said? Like I said, I like to maybe describe actions and then you know who's speaking, but you're not using a verb to carry the dialogue. You're just reminding the reader of whatever actor happens to be saying that dialogue at that time. So anyway, leave me your thoughts down below where you stand on that particular debate. I don't think it's a hard and fast rule, but I think if you're doing it too much, it will disrupt the flow a little bit. So let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys next time. Newest book is, I don't have a hard copy of it here because my wife's reading it, Shadow and Smoke. It's the third part of Moonsong. You can read the whole trilogy. And then there's 2 other books that are out now. Pulp Rock, which is a collection that features one of my 2-hour books, a novella called Farewell to Once and Future Kings. That is available now, and I'll link that down below, as well as the completely free collection of essays and stories called Generation Y, edited by J.D. Cowan. Pulp Rock is edited by Alexander Helene. So please check both of those out, as well as all my other books, and you can hop on my mailing list at dvspress.com/books, and I'll see you guys next time.